In the grand halls of empire, beneath the velvet robes and polished crowns, lived 30 royals whose desires defied every rule they were born to uphold. These aren't tales of duty and honor. These are the secrets buried behind palace walls, too scandalous for history books, too human to ignore. From voyeuristic kings to cross-dressing princes and queens who weaponize seduction, this is the monarchy like you've never seen it, unfiltered, unholy, and utterly fascinating. Welcome to 30 Most Perverted British Royals in History, where the crown slips, the masks crack, and the truth is far stranger than fiction. Before we dive headfirst into velvet-lined scandal, take a second to subscribe. If you're into royal chaos, whispered scenes, and the kind of history they definitely didn't teach in school, you're in the right place. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We want to know who else is up late wandering through the shadows of the crown. 1. King Edward VII. There are two kinds of kings, those who rule by divine right, and those who rule from the chaise lounge of a Parisian brothel with a cigar in one hand and a custom-built sex chair in the other. Edward VII was not the kind of monarch who wrote philosophy or battled in mud-soaked armor. He preferred silk sheets, perfumed letters, and the sound of uncorked champagne echoing through rooms that smelled faintly of velvet and scandal. Before he was king, he was simply Bertie, the corpulent, charming eldest son of Queen Victoria, a woman who loathed sensuality so much she once considered sex a necessary but regrettable duty. Bertie, predictably, rebelled by turning sensuality into a lifestyle brand. His mother blamed him personally for the premature death of his father, believing the stress of Bertie's public dalliances had hastened Prince Albert's demise. She wasn't entirely wrong. As Prince of Wales, Edward's reputation became inseparable from what the French called the siège d'amour, a custom-designed love seat stationed in his favorite Parisian bordello, Le Chabanais. The contraption, built to support his considerable girth and various acrobatics, allowed the future monarch to engage in vigorous activity with minimal strain. It also included stirrups and a handlebar. It was less a chair and more a testimony to imperial engineering priorities. To be clear, his escapades weren't hidden. He made no real effort to disguise his movements through the salons and bedrooms of Europe. His name was whispered among chorus girls, actresses, and the occasional diplomat's wife. At the Marlborough Club in London, he kept private chambers where courtiers supposedly knew not to knock, unless bearing oysters, brandy, or very specific apologies. His inner circle was a revolving cast of aristocratic libertines and theatrical muses. Lady Randolph Churchill, mother of Winston, is alleged to have kept him company. Lily Langtry, the Jersey Lily, became his most public mistress, an affair so widely known that society simply shrugged. For Bertie, discretion was never the point. His conquests were less about secrecy and more about ritual, a kind of sensual diplomacy that softened the empire's rough edges with laughter, lingerie, and baccarat crystal. But was it just excess? Or was there something deeper gnawing at the core of Edward's indulgences? He spent most of his life waiting to ascend, waiting for his mother to die, waiting to be taken seriously. It's possible that sex, for him, wasn't rebellion, but compensation. If the crown wouldn't come, at least he could master other arenas: flesh, desire, control. In every embrace, a reminder that though powerless in politics, he was still a prince of appetites. Historians tried to rehabilitate him later. They spoke of his diplomacy, his charm, his modernization of the monarchy's public image. But the truth still lies in velvet-lined corners and forgotten hotel registers. King Edward VII didn't need to rule in the traditional sense. He ruled the undercurrent, the world of whispered liaisons and luxurious indulgence, and he did it with all the subtlety of a satin sledgehammer. And yet, even he might have raised a monocled eyebrow at his son's private stash of corsets and clandestine portraits. Because if Bertie was decadent, then George IV was downright operatic. 2. King George IV. If Edward VII was the Emperor of Indulgence, then George IV was the theatrical understudy who took it too far and demanded a standing ovation anyway. To call him flamboyant would be like calling the ocean damp. George didn't just indulge. He adorned, exaggerated, embroidered, and then posed dramatically in front of a mirror to admire his own ruin. Where his father, George III, descended into madness, George IV ascended into something arguably worse. Expensive taste, fragile ego, and an uncontrollable appetite for attention, affection, and undergarments that were not his own. From his earliest years as Prince of Wales, George made it known that he had no interest in the rigid constraints of royal dignity. He preferred pleasure, preferably the kind that involved layers of silk, complicated disguises, and a very specific ambiance involving velvet, perfume, and secrecy poorly kept. As a young man, he secretly and illegally married Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, knowing full well that the union was invalid under British law. But the heart wants what the heart wants, especially if it's forbidden, dramatic, and comes with handwritten letters to hide under your pillow. Behind the polished court portraits and exaggerated Regency finery was a man compulsively drawn to the theatrical. George reportedly maintained an elaborate collection of women's underclothing, not just as keepsakes of lovers, but as personal items he wore during private moments. His fetishistic tendencies, as chroniclers politely phrased them, included an obsession with corsets, lace, and the sensations of tightness and transformation. The Prince Regent was a cross-dresser in a time when such behavior could have brought ruin, yet he strutted through his personal fantasies like he was center stage at Covent Garden. And then there were the paintings. Tucked away in Windsor Castle and other private royal estates were dozens of erotic portraits and miniatures, not merely romantic or artistic, but explicitly styled to satisfy his particular tastes. These weren't the kind of paintings you showed at dinner parties, unless your idea of conversation starters involved the phrase, "Please don't tell Parliament." George hoarded them in locked cabinets, accessible only to the most trusted of footmen, and possibly to those whose silence could be purchased with titles, land, or the promise of pensions. His excesses weren't confined to the bedroom. George IV's entire life was a spectacle of overindulgence. He once spent over £200,000, in today's money, tens of millions, refurbishing the Royal Pavilion in Brighton into an opium dream of Indo-Chinese excess. Golden dragons on the walls, palm tree columns, and ceilings designed to look like the inside of an imperial fever dream. It was less a home and more a manifesto for a life dedicated to the ornamental. Of course, his vices didn't go unnoticed. Caricaturists and pamphleteers of the age had a field day. They called him the Prince of Wales, mocking his increasing girth and decreasing shame. Politicians muttered about his moral corruption, and the public began to see in him a man bloated not just by food and drink, but by unchecked desire for the extravagant and the erotic. But perhaps the most tragicomic part of George's story is how desperately he wanted to be loved, genuinely, lastingly, and not just by his reflection or the paid courtesans of his elaborate fantasies. In many ways, his perversions weren't expressions of dominance or power, but of loneliness with a crown on top. He created a kingdom of illusion, where gender could bend, roles could reverse, and desire could dance behind closed velvet doors. And in that kingdom, he was finally free. Still, for all his flourishes, George never danced quite as close to the abyss as his grandson, the handsome, tragic Duke of Kent, whose appetites were as dangerous as they were deadly. And while George IV was busy cross-dressing behind closed doors, his empire was unraveling in plain sight, lace, debt, and all. If you're still with us deep in the royal archives, make sure you subscribe. It helps more than you know. And hey, curious minds think alike. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you doom scrolling at 3 a.m. in Toronto? Or hiding your earbuds in class somewhere in Delhi? Drop it in the comments. We're building a midnight society of royal misfits. 3. Prince George, Duke of Kent. If George IV was a man trapped by excess, his great-grandson, Prince George, Duke of Kent, was consumed by it. He belonged to the generation that watched the British Empire begin to crumble in slow motion, a world where the monarchy was supposed to symbolize dignity amid decline. Yet behind the royal facade of pressed uniforms and stiff photographs, George lived a double life that read less like a royal biography and more like a noir novel written in a haze of morphine and perfume. Born in 1902, the Duke of Kent was the fourth son of George V and Queen Mary, the so-called model royals who valued formality above everything. In the public imagination, their sons were the golden heirs of a fading empire. But George was the misfit, the beautiful, unpredictable one. He had the kind of allure that could silence a room, the piercing blue eyes, the languid charm, the voice smooth enough to make even his brothers nervous. And unlike his father, he had no interest in duty for duty's sake. He wanted sensation. His reputation in London's interwar years was one of restless indulgence. He was drawn to speed, cars, planes, parties that blurred into morning. There were whispers about his nights with socialites, actresses, and, more dangerously for the time, with men of both aristocratic and artistic circles. Noel Coward was often mentioned in the same breath as the Duke, though both denied anything beyond friendship. The truth, as always in royal matters, was neither simple nor public. But those who knew George described him as someone who lived with the intensity of a man aware that his life would not last long. The Duke's vices, if one can call them that, went beyond the carnal. He was enthralled by the mood-altering glamour of narcotics, opium, cocaine, morphine, the elixirs of escape that floated through the private salons of Mayfair and the secret corners of Paris. Some said he could never quite live without the tension between danger and delight. The line between control and collapse fascinated him, and he walked it elegantly until it started to walk him. His marriage to Princess Marina of Greece was meant to stabilize him, and for a time it did. They were a striking couple, photogenic, cosmopolitan, the very image of modern royalty. Yet even within that marriage, George was restless. There were affairs, rumored, never proven, that involved both high society and the underworld. His name surfaced in police reports connected to blackmail schemes that were quietly buried before the press could sniff them out. Scotland Yard had its instructions: protect the crown, even from itself. But the real tragedy of the Duke of Kent wasn't just moral decline. It was the quiet, gnawing sadness that came from knowing he was born into a cage gilded so beautifully it blinded the world. The roaring parties, the dangerous friendships, the clandestine meetings, all were attempts to escape the suffocating perfection of being a Windsor. Every indulgence, every whispered scandal, was a rebellion against the image of the obedient younger son. And then, just as abruptly as he'd lived, the Duke's story ended in flames. In 1942, his plane crashed into a Scottish hillside during a secret wartime mission. The official story was one of patriotic service, the brave royal lost in the line of duty. But the unofficial whispers never stopped. Why was he there? What was the mission? Why did witnesses report behavior so erratic before takeoff? The crash file was sealed, the questions filed under national interest. Prince George's life remains a riddle written in smoke, a man too beautiful for his own good, too curious for his own safety, too royal to ever truly belong anywhere. Some said he was cursed. Others said he was simply born into the wrong century. He chased sensation because sensation was the only thing that felt real. And as his story dissolved into rumor, it left behind a single question, the same one that would haunt another doomed royal centuries before him. What happens when passion and power become indistinguishable? Because before Prince George ever flirted with danger in the jazz-lit corners of London, there was another George, Edward II of England. who discovered that desire itself could topple a throne. 4. Edward II of England. Most kings struggle to balance love and power. Edward II didn't even pretend to try. His reign reads like a cautionary tale of what happens when affection becomes a political weapon, and intimacy turns into national scandal. Where his father, the fearsome Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, had ruled with an iron fist and a blood-soaked sword, Edward II ruled with something far softer: an open heart, a disastrous sense of loyalty, and a penchant for surrounding himself with the wrong men at precisely the wrong times. Born in 1284, Edward came into a world defined by warfare and conquest. But unlike his father, he wasn't a soldier at heart. He was theatrical, affectionate, and drawn to music, poetry, and the company of handsome young courtiers. Most notably, one courtier, Piers Gaveston. The two became inseparable, a bond so close, so emotionally intense, and so disruptive to the court's power dynamics that it would come to define Edward's entire legacy. Contemporary chroniclers wrote with barely restrained disgust. They accused Edward of giving his whole heart to Gaveston, of granting him lavish gifts and political power far beyond reason. Gaveston was made Earl of Cornwall, a title typically reserved for royalty, and allowed to flaunt his influence with an arrogance that only made enemies faster. Nobles complained that Edward ignored their counsel, choosing instead to lose himself in Gaveston's wit and flattery. One chronicler described their relationship as beyond natural affection, which, in medieval political code, was as close to a public accusation as one could print without invoking divine wrath. It was more than jealousy. The nobles saw Gaveston as a parasite, but worse, they saw Edward as weak. A king ruled by passion, not principle. Gaveston was eventually exiled, recalled, exiled again, and finally captured and executed by a group of disgruntled barons. His death didn't just break Edward's heart. It broke what was left of his grip on power. And yet, the king didn't learn. He found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant and theatrical, Despenser was calculating and ruthless. Their relationship, again unusually close and overly privileged, reignited the fury of the barons. Despenser and his father gained extraordinary power, stripping nobles of land and humiliating the Queen, Isabella of France. The whispers grew louder. Edward had once more chosen infatuation over governance. It wasn't just court gossip. Foreign diplomats reported back to their kings that the English monarch was enslaved by Despenser. Even the clergy, normally discreet, began voicing concerns about the moral decay at court. Whether Edward's relationships were romantic, erotic, or simply emotionally codependent is a question historians still debate. But to his contemporaries, the optics alone were enough to spark rebellion. Eventually, the country revolted. Queen Isabella, humiliated and sidelined, allied herself with her lover Roger Mortimer and led a successful invasion of England. Edward was captured and forced to abdicate. Despenser was executed in brutal public fashion. Edward himself was imprisoned, his end shrouded in mystery, myth, and revision. What makes Edward II so fascinating isn't merely that he broke taboos, but that he did so openly, insistently, and with a kind of tragic devotion that almost seems out of place in medieval statecraft. He didn't hide his affection. He wore it like a crown, even when it cost him everything. Today, he's remembered less for policy or war, and more for his strange, haunting vulnerability. A monarch too honest about his desires, too blind to political consequences, too consumed by the people he loved to notice the knives behind their backs. In a court full of secrets, Edward's biggest crime might have been sincerity. But if his passions brought down a throne, then his successor in scandal, King James VI and I, showed what happens when the crown embraces its desires with calculation instead of innocence. 5. King James VI and I, If Edward II's reign was undone by the tenderness of his heart, James VI and I reigned with a mind so brilliant, paranoid, and contradictory that his desires became political philosophy. The first monarch to rule both Scotland and England under one crown, James is remembered as a scholar king, the man who commissioned the King James Bible, survived the Gunpowder Plot, and wrote treatises on kingship, witchcraft, and human behavior. But beneath the intellect was a pattern that mirrored his predecessors, a monarch whose private affections shaped his public destiny and whose fascination with certain beautiful young men stirred whispers in every corridor of power. James was born in 1566 to Mary, Queen of Scots, herself a scandal wrapped in a crown. He grew up amid treason, assassination attempts, and exile, learning early that love was dangerous and loyalty a currency more valuable than gold. His tutors raised him on scripture, stoicism, and suspicion. By the time he reached his teens, James was already brilliant, lonely, and wary of affection that came too easily, which made it all the more striking when, as king, he surrounded himself with favorites he seemed to love with disarming openness. The most famous of these relationships was with George Villiers, later the Duke of Buckingham. Villiers was elegant, ambitious, and dazzlingly confident, the kind of man who could charm a parliament into silence. When he entered court, James's fascination was instantaneous. He elevated Villiers through the ranks of nobility with breathtaking speed, showering him with titles, lands, and letters that left little room for misinterpretation. "Christ had his John," James once wrote, "and I have my George." It was an unusually intimate declaration for a 17th century king, and one that historians have debated ever since. Was James's affection purely platonic? Was it romantic, spiritual, or something else entirely? A projection of the love he'd never safely known as a child? The letters between them suggest a bond layered with affection, dependence, and power. James wrote of longing, of the pain of absence, of joy at reunion. His words were the kind that could melt any courtier's composure. For his critics, it was confirmation of their worst fears, that the king's heart was guided not by divine reason, but by personal devotion. His enemies, both political and religious, exploited it. Pamphlets circulated with thinly veiled insinuations about the king's minion. Parliament muttered about corruption. Even foreign diplomats recorded their astonishment at how openly affectionate James was toward Villiers. Yet the king seemed unbothered. Perhaps he saw no sin in love if it was loyal. Perhaps he believed himself untouchable, anointed by God. Or perhaps, after a lifetime of plots and betrayals, he simply refused to live without the one thing he trusted: human connection, however scandalous it seemed. What makes James VI and I fascinating isn't the rumor itself, but how he intellectualized it. He wrote about love as a form of governance, mutual affection as the glue that held society together. To James, a king was both father and lover to his realm, bound by a sacred intimacy. His public affection for his favorites wasn't just indulgence. It was political theater, a living metaphor for loyalty rewarded. And yet, even metaphors can ignite suspicion. By the time he died in 1625, James had unified crowns but divided reputations. To some, he was a visionary intellectual who brought order and scripture to a fractured island. To others, he was a king led astray by the beauty of his courtiers, a monarch too fond of companionship to notice how the court whispered behind his back. But perhaps that's what makes his legacy endure. The paradox of a man who could write one of the most revered works of Christian translation while living a life that quietly defied its moral boundaries. James's story closes not with scandal, but with a quiet irony. The man who preached divine right spent his life proving how human kings truly are. And in that contradiction, between power and affection, intellect and desire, he paved the way for his heir, a monarch who would make the art of indulgence a royal institution, King Charles II. 6. King Charles II. If James I intellectualized his affections, King Charles II turned them into an institution. His court was not merely permissive, it was theatrical. Scandal wasn't something to be hushed up, it was practically a currency. Charles, restored to the throne in 1660 after years of Republican austerity, arrived like a man who had waited too long to live. He didn't waste a single second pretending to be holy. He was witty, rakish, cynical, and utterly disinterested in the performative piety that had dominated the Puritan years. His reign didn't just mark the restoration of the monarchy, it marked the restoration of desire. The court of Charles II was a place of powdered wigs, whispered affairs, painted mistresses, and evenings that never seemed to end. To the outside world, it was dazzling. To moralists, it was horrifying. At the center of it all stood Charles himself, tall, dark, and famously charming. He kept a rotating roster of official and unofficial mistresses, many of whom were given titles, pensions, and homes. Names like Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Carouaille, and Moll Davis became household references, not for their virtue, but for their proximity to the king's bed and the favors that flowed from it. But Charles's interest wasn't purely sexual. He was, in many ways, a voyeur of his own court. He enjoyed surrounding himself with intrigue, scandal, and contradiction. He famously referred to his mistresses as my unofficial cabinet, a line both humorous and uncomfortably accurate. He encouraged a kind of performative flirtation within court, where women were simultaneously decoration and influence, and men competed not for policy, but for proximity to gossip. Whitehall Palace became the stage. Charles often observed court games and bedroom dramas with the amusement of a man watching his own reality show. He relished in the duplicity of it all. Those around him were rewarded not for virtue, but for style, seduction, and the ability to keep secrets with a grin. His court painter, Sir Peter Lely, captured this perfectly. Portraits of sultry-eyed women draped in mythological allegory, pretending to be Venus or Diana, while everyone knew they were playing someone else entirely. And then there were the rumors of Charles himself, the voyeur, the instigator, the man who supposedly enjoyed watching his court unravel in lustful theatrics. While some of these stories were likely embroidered by his enemies, the impression they left behind was potent. A monarch whose pleasures were not just indulgent, but structural. Scandal wasn't a side effect of Charles's reign, it was the design. Unlike Edward II or James I, Charles wasn't destroyed by his appetites because he never tried to disguise them. His charisma shielded him. His cynicism protected him. He saw the moralists coming a mile away and raised them a wink, a mistress, and a tax on tea. The public, exhausted by decades of Puritanism, largely shrugged. After all, wasn't it better to have a king with flaws and charm than a parliament full of saints and no sense of humor? But there's a deeper irony here. For all his libertinism, Charles remained politically astute. He kept England mostly at peace, navigated the stormy waters of religious tension, and avoided the kind of absolutist overreach that would doom his brother later. He ruled like a man who knew his time was borrowed, and perhaps it was. By the end of his reign, Charles had fathered over a dozen illegitimate children, none of whom could legally inherit the crown. His official legacy was sterile, but his personal one ran riot through the veins of half the English aristocracy. His final words, characteristically understated, were reportedly, "Let not poor Nellie starve." A king of appetite indeed. But where Charles wore his scandal like a badge, the next royal in line cloaked hers in whisper, letter, and longing. Because Queen Anne's story was one of silence, devotion, and a kind of intimacy that refused to name itself. 7. Queen Anne. In a court obsessed with airs, appearances, and alliances, Queen Anne's legacy is a quiet rebellion, one that unfolded not with grand affairs or lurid scandals, but through an emotionally charged intimacy that left historians both fascinated and divided. Her reign, which stretched from 1702 to 1714, is usually remembered for unifying England and Scotland under one crown for the War of the Spanish Succession, or for the political rise of the Whigs and Tories. But behind the powdered wigs and parliamentary debates was a far more delicate drama, one that unfolded through letters, glances, and the unbearable weight of affection in a palace built for distance. Anne was not a flamboyant figure. She was chronically ill, deeply religious, and privately melancholic. Yet at the center of her world stood Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, a woman whose influence was so potent it redrew not only court politics, but also the emotional architecture of the Queen's life. Their relationship began in childhood and blossomed into something intense, exclusive, and eventually volatile. Anne called her Mrs. Freeman. Sarah, in turn, called Anne Mrs. Morley. The nicknames were a small rebellion, two women pretending, in their private correspondence, to be equals in a world that refused them the dignity of emotional freedom. The letters between them are suffused with longing, jealousy, and a kind of desperate closeness that feels too intimate to be casual. Anne wrote with affection and vulnerability, often imploring Sarah to remain close, to stay loyal, to write more. "I hope I shall get a letter from you tonight," Anne once wrote. "I long for it." These weren't political dispatches, they were emotional lifelines. And as Sarah's political power grew, so did her ability to wound. Sarah was brilliant, assertive, and politically savvy, everything Anne struggled to be in public. But their relationship eventually collapsed under the weight of ambition and unmet emotional needs. Sarah began to resent Anne's clinginess, and Anne, in turn, grew wary of Sarah's influence. Into this vacuum stepped Abigail Masham, a quieter, more pliant cousin of Sarah's, whose rise in Anne's affections became the subject of endless speculation. To Sarah, Abigail was a usurper. To Anne, she was comfort. The triangle sparked political mutiny, pamphlets, satire, and subtle accusations. Some claimed that Abigail had supplanted Sarah not just in politics, but in the Queen's heart, and possibly her bed. There's no definitive evidence of a physical relationship, and perhaps that's the point. The scandal lived in implication, not fact. It wasn't what they did. It was the intensity of what they meant to each other that unnerved the court. In the end, Anne died alone, outliving her 17 children, her closest friends, and the very affection that had once animated her life. Her reign brought constitutional stability, but her personal world remained fraught with emotional turbulence. She was a queen with absolute power and almost no personal freedom, a woman remembered less for what she said and more for how she loved. And if Queen Anne's intimacy was shrouded in silence, the next monarch, Henry VIII, ensured his were carved into history with ink, blood, and a royal signature. 8. Henry VIII. Henry VIII's love life wasn't just a private affair. It was a national emergency. Most monarchs marry for diplomacy. Henry married for obsession, discarded for convenience, and punished for disobedience. He turned matrimony into a matter of state and desire into legal precedent. His 6 wives are famous, but it wasn't the number that shocked his contemporaries. It was the speed, the spectacle, and the deadly implications of disappointing the king. Born in 1491, Henry was never supposed to be king. That role belonged to his older brother Arthur, who died young. Henry inherited the throne, and in many ways, never quite outgrew the insecurity of being second choice. His early years as king were filled with promise. He was athletic, educated, pious, and handsome. But beneath the Renaissance polish was a man with appetites that grew sharper with age and power. Henry's court was a gilded stage, where romance was tangled with espionage and seduction came with a political price tag. He surrounded himself with music, poetry, and beauty, especially beauty that bowed. The line between affection and ambition was dangerously thin. Courtly flirtation was encouraged, but only if the king wasn't watching. And if he was, it was no longer flirtation. It was a royal summons. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was the most conventional match. A Spanish princess, a Catholic union, and a strategic alliance. But when she failed to produce a male heir, Henry became restless. His fixation shifted to Anne Boleyn, a woman who understood that holding a king's attention required calculation. She denied him access, and in doing so, rewrote history. Henry broke with Rome, founded the Church of England, and redefined the nature of royal authority, all to legitimize his desire. The marriage was short, intense, and ultimately tragic. Anne bore him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Her fall from grace was as swift as her rise, and her execution set a new standard for how personal rejection could be dressed up as national security. But Henry didn't stop. He moved from one wife to another. Jane Seymour, who gave him the son he longed for and then died. Anne of Cleves, whom he rejected for being unattractive. Catherine Howard, whose youth and flirtations led to her beheading. And Catherine Parr, who survived him. Each relationship reflected Henry's deepening paranoia and his desire for control disguised as romantic destiny. Beyond the marriages, there were rumors of private affairs, secret mistresses, and court-sponsored discretion. Henry's need for affection was never just personal. It was political theater, meant to reinforce his virility, his authority, and his divine right to rule. His relationships were framed in the language of morality, but beneath the surface, they were often transactional, strategic, and driven by insecurity masked as dominance. What makes Henry's romantic life so unsettling is how fully it was absorbed into the machinery of governance. Desire became decree, love became law, and bodies, wives, heirs, even reputations, became collateral damage. But for all his brutality and excess, Henry never faced the same kind of propaganda that would haunt the next figure on this list, Mary, Queen of Scots, whose own desires became weapons in a war of perception, seduction, and betrayal. 9. Mary, Queen of Scots. In the theater of royal scandal, Mary, Queen of Scots played every role: ingenue, widow, seductress, traitor, martyr, and somehow, all at once. Her life, already complicated by dynastic politics and international alliances, became further tangled by a string of relationships so politically explosive and emotionally charged that they overshadowed nearly everything else she achieved. But unlike her cousin Elizabeth I, who kept her desires in a locked box behind a public mask of virginity, Mary's passions spilled out into the open, and the consequences followed like a curse. Born in 1542, Mary inherited the Scottish throne at just 6 days old. She spent much of her early life in the French court, where Catholic opulence and romantic intrigue were a kind of formal education. She was married to the Dauphin of France by age 15, widowed at 18, and returned to Scotland as a teenage queen carrying both foreign manners and a dangerously independent mind. From the start, she didn't fit the mold. She was intelligent, cultured, and dazzling in a court that preferred its queens obedient and quiet. She was neither. Her second marriage, to her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, might have looked ideal on paper, uniting two claims to the English throne, but in practice, it spiraled into disaster. Darnley was vain, jealous, and volatile. He resented Mary's authority and became obsessed with her trusted Italian secretary, David Rizzio. The court buzzed with rumors that Rizzio had too much influence, that Mary was too fond of him, that something unspoken hung in the air between them. The truth? No one knows. But the scandal exploded when Darnley and a group of lords burst into Mary's private chambers and murdered Rizzio in front of her. She was pregnant at the time. The shock of Rizzio's assassination didn't end Mary's troubles. It was only the beginning. Darnley was found dead less than a year later under mysterious circumstances. A house explosion followed by strangulation. The prime suspect? James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, Mary's protector, rumored lover, and eventual third husband. The marriage to Bothwell, which happened just weeks after Darnley's murder, was seen by many as a public admission of guilt. Whether she loved him, feared him, or was coerced by him remains unclear. The optics alone were catastrophic. What followed was a slow-motion political collapse. Her nobles turned against her. She was forced to abdicate. She fled to England, hoping for protection from Elizabeth I, and instead found herself imprisoned for nearly 2 decades. The once dazzling queen became a political liability wrapped in Catholic symbolism and lingering suspicion. Her love life, whether real, rumored, or manipulated, was the easiest weapon to use against her. Her enemies painted her as reckless, lustful, and morally compromised. Pamphlets accused her of filthy lusts, of corrupting her court, of trading crowns for caresses. Never mind the lack of evidence. In the political imagination, Mary wasn't just a fallen queen. She was Eve in a gown, dragging kingdoms down with her. She was executed in 1587 for plotting against Elizabeth, though by then her fate was sealed less by conspiracy and more by reputation. Mary died a Catholic martyr, a political threat, and an object of centuries-long fascination. Her passions, whether genuine or forced into legend, reshaped nations. And yet, the most tragic irony? Her son would become the same king who intellectualized forbidden love from a throne. But before we get to him, there's a shadowy figure tucked into the royal margins, one whose scandals were quieter but no less controversial. Prince Albert Victor, whose name still drifts through the fog of Victorian mystery. 10. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. In the dim, gaslit corners of Victorian London, where fog clung to cobblestones and reputations lived or died on a whisper, Prince Albert Victor moved like a shadow with a crown. The eldest son of Edward VII and second in line to the British throne, he was born into the most scrutinized family in the world. And yet, decades later, his legacy is less about what he did than what people said he might have done. To the public, he was Prince Eddie, a soft-spoken, somewhat aloof royal with a faint smile and a vacant stare. He wasn't considered intellectually brilliant, nor politically ambitious. Courtiers often described him as gentle and charming, but a step behind the conversation. His tutors complained of his inability to concentrate. His military service was undistinguished. To some, he was simply a dull royal placeholder. But the more invisible he seemed in public, the more magnetic he became in private rumor. It was in the 1889 Cleveland Street scandal that his name first surfaced. Not officially, but through a fog of insinuation. A male brothel in London was discovered by police, frequented by aristocrats and young telegraph boys. As names of clients began to surface, some whispered, others scrubbed, there was talk that Prince Eddie might have been among them. Officially, his name was never linked to the case. Unofficially, it hovered like a specter. The British press, bound by deference and censorship laws, remained silent. But foreign papers, particularly in Europe, were less restrained. The idea of a future king implicated in a scandal involving homosexuality, a criminal offense in Victorian England, was too tantalizing to ignore. The palace denied everything, of course, and historians remain divided to this day. Was it political slander, mistaken identity, or a carefully covered truth too dangerous to reveal? Adding to the mystique, Eddie's personality made him a perfect canvas for projection. He was emotionally reserved, somewhat awkward, and prone to illness. These traits, combined with his proximity to scandal, made him a magnet for myth. His premature death in 1892 at age 28, from influenza complicated by pneumonia, only intensified the mystery. He died before he could rule, before he could explain or be forced to deny anything. And then came the darkest theory of all, that Prince Albert Victor was not only linked to scandal, but may have been Jack the Ripper. This claim, entirely unproven and widely debunked, emerged decades after his death, fueled by sensationalist books and conspiracy-minded historians. The logic was thin, the timeline inconsistent, but the idea refused to die. It stuck because it fit a pattern: the unknown royal, the repressed prince, the whispered deviant. What remains today is less fact and more fog. Prince Eddie's life, carefully managed in public and distorted in private, reflects the Victorian paradox itself. Moral on the surface, feverish underneath. Whether he was guilty of any wrongdoing or simply born into a machine that devoured the faint and the different, we'll never know. But the palace learned a lesson from Eddie's shadowy legacy. Secrecy only feeds speculation. And the next royal on our list, King William III, would face similar whispers, this time carried not by scandalous brothels, but through candle-lit corridors and Protestant pamphlets. 11. King William III. By the time William III arrived on English soil in 1688, invited by Protestant nobles to depose his Catholic father-in-law, he wasn't just stepping into a throne, he was stepping into centuries of royal paranoia, religious anxiety, and very British speculation about what went on behind palace doors. The Glorious Revolution gave him power without bloodshed, but not without whispers. Because while William was hailed as the savior of Protestant England, his personal life began to invite questions the crown wasn't quite prepared to answer. Publicly, William of Orange was cold, dutiful, and awkwardly reserved. He was the kind of king who seemed more comfortable on horseback or drafting treaties than entertaining courtiers. His marriage to Queen Mary II, his first cousin and co-ruler, was formal, functional, and politically effective. Theirs was a union forged in dynastic calculation, not in letters or longing. They ruled side by side, yet their personal interactions often seemed distant, even performative. To many, William simply appeared uninterested, and that's precisely where the rumors began to multiply. William kept the company of a tight inner circle, particularly a few male courtiers who rose through the ranks with surprising speed and received lavish titles, lands, and access. One name appeared over and over: Arnold van Keppel, a young Dutch nobleman who came to England with William and quickly became his groom of the bedchamber. That title, historically innocent, carried a weight of implication when paired with gossip and resentment. Van Keppel's rapid elevation sparked fury among English nobles, many of whom felt sidelined and humiliated by the foreign king's private favoritism. Pamphleteers began to take notice, and in late 17th century England, political pamphlets were the closest thing to tabloids, anonymous, acidic, and eagerly consumed. William was accused of lavishing his affections on young male favorites. Satirists labeled him calamus, a classical euphemism drawn from homoerotic poetry. The implications were coded but understood. The throne was secure, but the man sitting on it was becoming a figure of suspicion, even among his Protestant allies. To be clear, there is no definitive evidence of a sexual relationship between William and any of his male courtiers. But in the world of court politics, perception was often more dangerous than fact. His wife Mary never publicly acknowledged the rumors, though she reportedly felt discomfort at the emotional intimacy William shared with his favorites. After her death, William never remarried, only fueling the theories. He became more isolated, more rigid, more emotionally unreachable. The real irony? William III was a man who came to England to impose moral clarity, restoring Protestant order, ousting a king accused of moral and religious excess. Yet his own reign became clouded by the same ambiguities he was supposed to cure. His military victories and constitutional reforms faded into the background as poets, pamphlets, and gossips picked apart the man behind the crown. And so the pattern continued. Another monarch defined not by war or policy, but by the uneasy silence between affection and power. A king who brought peace to the nation, but not to his own myth. But long before William, and even longer before political pamphlets, there was another royal figure whose intimate attachments stirred the same kind of speculation. Only this one shared his bed not with courtiers, but with a rival king. Richard the Lionheart, crusader, conqueror, and companion of kings. 12. King Richard I. The Lionheart. If medieval kings are remembered for their sword arms, Richard Versh is remembered for swinging his in every direction except home. Known to history as the Lionheart, he was crowned King of England in 1189, and then promptly left the country. He spent only about 6 months of his 10-year reign on English soil, a detail his admirers tend to overlook, and his accountants certainly did not. But Richard wasn't a man of ledgers or laws. He was a crusader king, a battlefield tactician, and, quietly, one of the most mysterious figures in the long, scandal-filled parade of British royalty. While Richard's military exploits, especially during the Third Crusade, made him a legend, his personal life has remained far less clearly defined. For centuries, historians have puzzled over the fact that Richard, a handsome and charismatic warrior king, showed little documented interest in women. He married Berengaria of Navarre, but there were no known children and no confirmed mistresses. In an age where royal virility was treated as a matter of national importance, Richard's marital detachment stood out. Even more unusual, his openly affectionate bond with another king. That king was Philip II of France. During the early years of the Crusade, Richard and Philip shared more than just an alliance. They shared lodgings, meals, and, according to at least one chronicler, a bed. They ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night the two kings slept in the same bed, wrote Roger of Hoveden. This, to be fair, was not uncommon among medieval aristocrats. Shared beds were often symbolic gestures of trust or convenience, but in Richard's case, the symbolism was far from innocent. Contemporaries murmured about unnatural affections. Clergy wrote disapprovingly, albeit vaguely. Later chroniclers, especially in the centuries that followed, began to hint more boldly. And in 1195, Richard himself made a public confession of sins of the flesh, and performed penance, though the exact nature of those sins was never detailed. The ambiguity has allowed speculation to flourish. Was this penance for same-sex relations? For something else? The records are as cryptic as they are tantalizing. Richard's relationship with Philip eventually soured. Politics and pride always win in the end, but the emotional intensity of their earlier alliance lingered in the historical record. Whether their closeness was political theater, romantic infatuation, or something more, we'll never know. But what we do know is this. Richard never produced a legitimate heir. He died in battle, childless, with his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine by his side, and his crown left to his brother John, the same John who would go on to become one of England's most reviled kings. In the end, Richard remains a paradox, a devout crusader who spent more time fighting Christians than Muslims, a lion-hearted king who rarely ruled his own kingdom, and a man whose greatest historical ambiguity lies not in how he died, but who may have been lying beside him. But if Richard's life was cloaked in poetic contradiction, the next ruler turned the art of royal image-making into something more orchestrated and more unsettling. Because Elizabeth I didn't just reject marriage, she transformed virginity into a form of erotic power. 13. Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I ruled alone, but never without an audience. In a court brimming with male ambition, foreign suitors, and advisors obsessed with dynastic succession, she remained unmarried for her entire 44-year reign. Officially, she was the Virgin Queen, a monarch who, unlike her scandal-laden predecessors, wrapped herself in a shroud of moral discipline and restraint. But, as with most royal myths, the image was sharper than the reality. Because Elizabeth may have rejected marriage, but she understood better than anyone how to seduce a nation. She inherited a poisoned throne in 1558. England was torn by religious division, economic instability, and the lingering trauma of her sister Mary's brutal reign. Elizabeth, only 25, had no husband, no children, and no political experience that mattered. What she did have was instinct. She knew the monarchy could no longer rely on divine right alone. It needed theater, and she was ready to perform. Her virginity, far from being a private matter, became a public doctrine. Portraits depicted her not as a woman, but as an icon, ageless, untouchable, surrounded by symbols of purity, wisdom, and celestial power. pearls, the moon, the phoenix. These weren't fashion choices. They were ideological weapons. Elizabeth took chastity and transformed it into charisma. She wasn't just a queen, she was a living metaphor. But beneath that carefully curated image were relationships so emotionally charged that they became their own form of scandal. Chief among them was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, her childhood friend, lifelong favorite, and the man whose name appeared in court gossip more often than any foreign ambassador. They were inseparable. He had private access to her chambers. He rode beside her in public processions. And while Elizabeth never confirmed anything beyond friendship, the intimacy between them was visible even to foreign envoys. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances, found at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck, the court erupted with speculation. Had she fallen? Had she been pushed? Was Dudley clearing a path to the throne? Elizabeth pulled back just enough to preserve her image, but never dismissed him. In her world, emotional proximity could be more powerful than marriage, and less politically binding. Later came the Earl of Essex, a younger favorite who mistook affection for power and paid the price with his head. Then came countless flirtations with foreign suitors, each one entertained just long enough to keep diplomatic interest alive. Elizabeth's court was a revolving carousel of men who admired her, adored her, and never quite understood that they were all part of the same performance. The irony, of course, is that her reign, which seemed to elevate restraint and deny desire, was saturated in erotic symbolism. The cult of Elizabeth wasn't anti-sexual. It was sexual, refracted through myth. She didn't eliminate the tension of royal romance. She held it on a leash and taught it to bow. But while Elizabeth weaponized chastity, her son, metaphorical and political, would turn voyeurism and court games into a more literal spectacle. King Charles I didn't play with symbols. He indulged in control, spectacle, and the kind of secrecy that only made the rumors louder. 14. King Charles I, where his father James had intellectualized desire and his predecessor Elizabeth I had sublimated it into statecraft. King Charles I brought the private pleasures of monarchy back behind the curtain, then left just enough of it peeking out to unsettle everyone watching. Reserved, devout, and refined to the point of fragility, Charles didn't flaunt scandal in the manner of his son, Charles II, but his reign, and especially his court, became a magnet for rumors of erotic decadence cloaked in ceremonial piety. Crowned in 1625, Charles inherited more than a throne. He inherited a kingdom on the edge of crisis. Religious tensions, financial instability, and an increasingly assertive parliament all demanded attention. But Charles's gaze often seemed elsewhere, drawn not to the messy grind of governance but to the aesthetics of divine kingship. He believed in majesty as something almost sacred, ordained by God and reflected in beauty, art, ritual, and control. His court became an extension of this belief. It was not bawdy or open like those of his predecessors. It was elegant, curated, and intensely theatrical. Masks and performances, often directed by Inigo Jones and penned by Ben Jonson, were filled with allegories of purity and power, of queens as goddesses and kings as chosen vessels of divine will. Behind the symbolism, however, was a carefully managed system of voyeurism and control. The royal household operated like a stage where the actors played at piety but whispered of very different things off script. Whispers abounded about Charles's interest in domination, not politically, but interpersonally. His private relationships, though fewer in number than those of other monarchs, were marked by intensity, exclusivity, and quiet imbalance. Henrietta Maria, his French Catholic queen, was young and vivacious, qualities that unsettled Protestant England from the start. Their marriage was tempestuous in its early years, full of dramatic fights and periods of cold silence. But Charles adored her, possibly to the point of worship. He commissioned endless portraits of her, posed like a saint, even as she stirred resentment among his subjects. In her presence, Charles was often deferential, In public, he insisted on her obedience. It was a dynamic that mirrored his larger rule. More than one court observer noted that Charles seemed most alive when orchestrating spectacle. He relished the structure of hierarchy, the command of ritual, the aesthetic perfection of loyalty. It was said that he would often delay decisions over matters of state in favor of discussing the staging of a mask or the positioning of a court portrait. His passions weren't chaotic. They were rehearsed. Yet even the most choreographed court can't control perception. Puritan pamphleteers accused him of moral hypocrisy, of surrounding himself with lascivious Catholics and corrupt influences. One particularly biting tract referred to his court as a veil of holiness masking a stage of sin. Whether the accusations had substance or not mattered little. They landed. And in a country already suspicious of his absolutist tendencies, the idea that Charles was privately indulgent and publicly pious only deepened the divide. Charles died, famously, by execution, his head removed on a cold January morning. But the myth that surrounded him didn't end there. His bloodline continued, along with the theater he helped stage. And just outside the spotlight stood another quiet royal, a man whose diaries suggested a fascination not with performance, but with watching. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, preferred the shadows. But as always in the monarchy, the shadows see everything. 15. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. Some royals chase scandal in broad daylight. Others leave only traces, half-erased diary entries, discreet rumors, and the occasional unexplained absence from official events. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was never a household name like his older brothers Edward and George. He never abdicated a throne for love, or died in a mysterious plane crash. But if you follow the margins closely, through the private papers, the whispered recollections, the careful revisions, you find a man whose relationship with power was less about control and more about observation. A watcher, not a player. And what he chose to watch has long fascinated historians. Born in 1900, Henry was the third son of King George V and Queen Mary, a role that came with all of the pressure and none of the glory. As the so-called spare to the spare, his job was to be invisible until needed. He wasn't groomed for the crown, nor given the freedom to live outside its orbit. Instead, he existed in a kind of royal limbo, duty-bound, closely managed, and quietly adrift. At first glance, his life seems almost aggressively proper. He served in the army, represented the crown abroad, and married late in life to Princess Alice, with whom he had 2 children. There were no public affairs, no scandals that reached the front pages. But behind this careful normalcy was a man who, according to fragments left behind, had interests that unsettled those closest to him. In private, Henry kept extensive journals, many of which have never been released in full. What little has emerged points to a reserved man with an intense curiosity about the more private behaviors of others. Former staff members, speaking decades after his death, described a prince who was known for lingering, at the edge of rooms, behind drawn curtains, always watching. He reportedly had a fascination with London's private clubs and underworld gatherings, though he rarely participated. He was more often seen as a quiet figure in the corner, perfectly dressed, politely aloof. There are repeated suggestions in correspondence between palace officials that Henry's interests, while not criminal or overtly scandalous, were unseemly for a royal. The language is vague, but the message is clear. His behavior required management. He was given extended foreign assignments, often at short notice. His security detail reportedly kept a discreet eye not just for threats against him, but for activities he might stumble into, or deliberately seek out. What makes Prince Henry so enigmatic is that he left so little behind, but just enough to keep the door open. He wasn't a libertine or a rebel. He was something more elusive, a royal who didn't need to act out to explore desire. He only needed to be near it, quietly. And perhaps that's why his story has never quite been told in full. Some scandals wear crowns, others wear gloves and keep their coats neatly buttoned. But not every royal left behind questions. Some, like his distant relative Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, left allegations so serious and unsettling they still echo through palace halls like an unresolved accusation. 16. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. If some royal scandals are remembered with a wink, the story of Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, is remembered in hushed tones, when it's remembered at all. His name has been quietly excised from most polished family trees, not because he was a footnote, but because he left behind a trail of rumors so disturbing, so persistent, and so deliberately buried that even centuries later, historians hesitate. If the British monarchy has a dark corner it doesn't like to clean, Ernest lives there, waiting. Born in 1771, the fifth son of King George III, Ernest Augustus was never supposed to matter. But in true Hanoverian fashion, fate twisted. His brothers died one by one, leaving Ernest, the least palatable among them, as heir to the throne of Hanover, a separate kingdom tied to Britain only by crown and blood. He eventually ruled there, not as a British prince, but as King of Hanover. Yet even before he wore a crown, he had already acquired the kind of reputation that made royal handlers sweat. In his youth, Ernest was widely disliked. He was brusque, cold, and carried an arrogance that made even his fellow royals uneasy. But it was the allegations, quiet at first, then louder, that defined his public image. Multiple servants accused him of harassment. One famously claimed to have been assaulted and silenced by threats. Another, his valet, allegedly died under mysterious circumstances, fueling decades of speculation that Ernest had him killed to suppress a scandal. The case was never solved, and no formal charges were brought, but the rumors took on a life of their own. Even the government briefly investigated, then closed the matter without comment. Then there was the matter of his sister, Princess Sophia. Among the most whispered about scandals of the Georgian era, gossip swirled that Ernest had fathered her child. The story appeared in pamphlets, letters, and court gossip, often accompanied by a tone of disbelief. Disbelief that anyone would be bold enough to write it down, and yet certainty that the story wouldn't go away. Official history calls the paternity unknown. Unofficial history barely needs to guess. Even Queen Victoria, never a woman to flinch at family dysfunction, was wary of Ernest. She reportedly found him repellent and deeply inappropriate, though even she stopped short of public condemnation. His ascension to the throne of Hanover in 1837, when Salic law barred Victoria herself from ruling there, was met with visible relief in England. He was gone, if not forgotten. What separates Ernest Augustus from the usual rogues gallery of royal libertines is the discomfort his story still causes. There's no charm, no tragic romance, no narrative that time has softened. Only a legacy of allegations, many unproven but never quite disproven. His name appears like a smudge across the family tree, impossible to scrub but too damaging to highlight. And yet, even among the notorious, Ernest wasn't unique in his appetites, because before him and after him came kings who traded morality for legacy, like Henry I, whose private passions populated an empire with children history barely bothered to count. 17. King Henry I. If monarchy is a performance, then King Henry I was the king who never left the backstage. His reign, 1100 to 1135, is typically remembered for its legal reforms, administrative innovations, and the chaos that followed his death. But behind the machinery of governance stood a man whose private life overflowed with so many lovers, liaisons, and illegitimate children that his personal biography reads less like a chronicle and more like an extended footnote in a genealogy textbook. Henry I fathered at least 20 illegitimate children, some claim as many as 30, and these weren't hidden away in quiet country estates. They were elevated, titled, married into noble families, and used as chess pieces in a game of dynastic control. His approach to personal legacy was simple. The more heirs, the more influence. Some kings left behind monuments. Henry left behind bloodlines. He was the youngest son of William the Conqueror, never expected to inherit the throne. Yet through luck, cunning, and a conveniently timed hunting accident involving his older brother William Rufus, the details of which remain suspiciously vague, Henry became king. From that point on, he ruled with a cold brilliance and a personal appetite that was equal parts calculated and compulsive. Henry's romantic relationships weren't about romance. They were about power, opportunity, and occasionally distraction. His mistresses came from all corners of society, some noble, others not. Many bore him children who would later rise to positions of surprising prominence. One daughter, Sibylla of Normandy, became Queen of Scotland. Several sons became earls or held lands in Wales and the Marches. It was as though Henry was quietly building his own shadow dynasty alongside the legitimate one. But what stands out isn't just the number of illegitimate children, it's how strategically he deployed them. Unlike some kings who tried to hide their extramarital offspring, Henry openly acknowledged many of them and used them as political instruments. They became bargaining chips in foreign policy, tools for pacifying rebellious lords, and placeholders in regions where trust in the crown was fragile. It was dynasty building through seduction, not succession. There's a curious irony in the fact that the man who left so many children behind died with only one legitimate heir, his beloved son William Adelin, who drowned in the White Ship disaster in 1120. That single event shattered Henry's carefully constructed succession plans and plunged England into a period of civil war known as the Anarchy. He had built a kingdom through desire and control, but in the end, his dynasty unraveled because the one child who could legally inherit it didn't survive. Henry II's life is a reminder that excess isn't always flamboyant. Sometimes it's systematic. He wasn't dramatic like later kings, nor publicly scandalous. His vice was quieter, an unrelenting pursuit of legacy by any means necessary. And in the shadows of his reign, another king would take the throne, one remembered not for building dynasties, but for tearing down reputations. Because next came John, whose name still stinks of scandal centuries after his crown was buried. 18. King John. If Henry VIII expanded his legacy by quietly multiplying it, his grandson King John is remembered for something far less productive: self-destruction. Crowned in 1199, John inherited a fractured empire and somehow made it worse. He didn't just lose land, he lost loyalty, credibility, and by the end of his reign, the royal dignity itself. Where other kings dabbled in scandal and got away with it, John seemed to specialize in turning personal vices into political collapse. And among his many flaws, his appetite, both for power and for possession, was the most corrosive. John's reputation was stained from the beginning. He was the youngest of Henry II's 5 sons, never expected to rule and nicknamed Lackland because he wasn't granted territory. As his older brothers died or fell out of favor, John clawed his way to the throne through opportunism, betrayal, and a convenient case of royal vacancy. But when he finally did take power, he governed less like a king and more like a jealous landlord. And nowhere was this more evident than in how he treated the people closest to him, particularly the women. Contemporary chroniclers did not like John, which is saying something, given that medieval historians were often court-appointed flatterers. He was described as tyrannical, cruel, and more tellingly, wicked in his pleasures. The chronicler Matthew Paris accused him of seducing noblewomen and even forcing himself on them while holding their husbands hostage. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by hostile monks or accurate reflections of John's behavior, they fed into a consistent theme. John was a king who did not understand restraint and did not care to. His court was a place of whispered fear rather than festive indulgence. He taxed mercilessly, punished arbitrarily, and ruled emotionally. He took what he wanted, including the wives and daughters of his barons, and made enemies of nearly everyone. Even his alliance with the Pope was marred by manipulation and submission. He was excommunicated in 1209 after defying papal authority, then later groveled for forgiveness to regain legitimacy. No one was surprised. It was the pattern of his life: break what isn't his, then beg for what he's broken. But the most damning evidence of his failure wasn't moral. It was logistical. He lost Normandy. He alienated the nobility so thoroughly that they forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, an act of humiliation wrapped in the pretense of reform. It was the first time a king had been so explicitly told, "You do not have absolute power." And while John agreed to the charter under pressure, he almost immediately tried to renege on it, igniting civil war in the final years of his reign. John died in 1216, most likely of dysentery during a military retreat. Fitting, perhaps, for a king whose legacy runs rancid even in legend. Unlike his brother Richard, the crusading romantic, John left behind no great victories, no epic tales, only a trail of bitterness, broken alliances, and accusations of luxurious wickedness. But even John, for all his predatory ambition, didn't draw the same voyeuristic fascination as those who followed him centuries later, like George I, whose private proclivities would make even the boldest baron raise an eyebrow. 19. King George for King George. I didn't want England, and England for the most part didn't want him either. When he arrived from Hanover in 1714 to assume the British throne, he barely spoke the language, showed no particular interest in the culture, and brought with him a quiet, joyless court that looked more like a legal department than a royal household. But behind his stiff exterior and Lutheran sensibilities was a man whose private life was far less restrained than his public image suggested, one filled with bitterness, voyeurism, and scandalous hypocrisy. George was married once, long before his ascension, to Sophia Dorothea of Celle. It was a politically arranged union between cousins, standard fare for 17th century dynastic planning. But from the beginning, their marriage was more a simmering power struggle than a romantic partnership. Sophia was spirited, social, and, as the whispers went, fond of affection not offered by her husband. George, on the other hand, was cold, authoritarian, and reportedly prone to controlling outbursts. When Sophia was discovered, or accused, of conducting an affair with Count Philip Königsmarck, George responded not with divorce, but with imprisonment. In 1694, Königsmarck vanished under murky circumstances, possibly murdered, and Sophia was locked away in a castle in Alden for the remainder of her life. She was never released, never pardoned, and officially erased from George's public narrative. Their children were told she had died. England barely knew she existed. This decision would have carried more weight if George himself had lived a chaste life. Instead, he took multiple mistresses, most notably Melusine von der Schulenburg, who followed him to England and was made Duchess of Kendal. She was not exactly embraced by the English elite. Politely described as gaunt, and less politely as the Maypole, Melusine wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. Another mistress, Erengard von der Schulenburg, yes, a different woman, also made the trip and was installed in a comfortable residence. The English press, still newly experimenting with political satire, wasted no time dubbing them the Elephant and the Maypole. It was not flattering. What sets George Vauban apart from other royal philanderers, however, isn't just his hypocrisy. It's the quiet cruelty of his private tendencies. Several reports and personal accounts hint that George had voyeuristic inclinations, not just in the metaphorical sense of observing court intrigue, but in more intimate contexts. He was reportedly fascinated with surveillance, who was meeting whom, what was said, what was not. Servants were said to operate under an atmosphere of constant scrutiny. His household was tightly run, not just for efficiency, but for observation. It's not that George flaunted immorality, he simply enforced it selectively. His wife's affair was a crime. His own liaisons were a right. He imprisoned Sophia for years, then filled her place with multiple unofficial queens. To George, power wasn't just about possession. It was about control. He wanted loyalty, obedience, and above all, silence. And yet, for all his restrictions, George I fathered a line of royals who would take pleasure to even more absurd levels. Because where George was secretive, his great-great-grandson Edward VIII would wear his private desires like medals, fetish, fixation, and all. 20. King Edward VIII. King Edward VIII reigned for less than a year, but he managed to scandalize the monarchy more deeply in those months than many did in decades. Officially, his story is one of abdication for love, a romantic tragedy where a king gave up his crown for an American divorcee. But beneath the familiar headlines and newsreel footage is a far more complicated portrait of a man driven not just by love, but by obsession, fetish, and a strange hunger for submission that upended both the monarchy and the moral fabric of his time. Before he became king, Edward, known as David to his inner circle, had already built a reputation as a womanizer. His charm was undeniable, dashing, modern, and devastatingly handsome in photographs. He embodied the idea of a glamorous, post-war royal. But insiders quickly realized that what he craved wasn't just affection, it was control through surrender. Behind the scenes, his relationships were marked by emotional dependency, secret rituals, and an attraction to women who dominated him psychologically. Enter Wallis Simpson. American, twice divorced, sharp-tongued and unbothered by royal protocol, she was everything the British establishment feared. To the press, she was an inappropriate match. To the monarchy, she was a constitutional crisis. But to Edward, she was something else entirely, the authority figure he had been searching for. Wallis didn't coddle him. She corrected him. She belittled him in public, rolled her eyes at his moods, and was known to treat him less like a king and more like a particularly needy houseguest. And he adored her for it. Their relationship, to those who observed it closely, wasn't traditional romance, it was dynamic. Edward, the heir to the greatest throne in the world, seemed almost desperate to be commanded. His letters to Wallis were gushing, almost infantilizing. He referred to her as my beloved controller. He asked for orders, begged for approval, and attached his emotional stability to her whims with startling intensity. Rumors swirled in diplomatic circles and behind palace walls that Edward harbored specific fetishes, ones Wallis either tolerated or exploited. Foreign intelligence agencies compiled psychological profiles suggesting he was unfit to rule, not merely because of his political views, which leaned disturbingly pro-German, but because of his psychological need to be dominated. Wallis, for her part, played the role well. Whether she loved him in return is unclear. What's certain is that she held all the power, and he couldn't have been happier about it. When Edward chose abdication over separation from her, it wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a final, irreversible act of submission, not just to Wallis but to the life he wanted. One without responsibility, governed not by duty, but desire. And so the crown passed to his brother, and Edward became the Duke of Windsor, a title that sounded dignified but came with a lifetime of exile and soft scandal. But if Edward relished submission, his uncle before him, Frederick, Duke of York, preferred command, especially from his own bed, where military promotions were apparently up for grabs, if you had the right connections, or the right company. 21. Prince Frederick, Duke of York. Some royal scandals unfold in dark corridors or behind closed doors. Others happen in full military dress, surrounded by ledgers, led by impulse, and lit by the steady glow of gas lamps and gossip. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, may not be a household name today, but in his lifetime, he was at the center of one of the most bizarre episodes in early 19th century royal history, a scandal not about love, but logistics. His alleged offense wasn't seduction, but corruption. And yet somehow, it still involved lace-trimmed boudoirs and war commissions traded from a mistress's bed. Born in 1763, Frederick was the second son of King George III and the brother of the future George IV. While his older brother was busy scandalizing London society with corsets and cross-dressing, Frederick was dispatched into the army, more duty-bound, more proper, and ostensibly more reliable. He rose swiftly through the ranks, not solely on merit, but on lineage. By the 1790s, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, a position of enormous influence during the height of the Napoleonic Wars. His tenure, at first, was seen as a stabilizing force. He reformed the Army's supply system, improved training standards, and tried to clean up the patronage rot that had long plagued the officer corps. But then came Mary Ann Clark. Clark was a former actress, sharp, ambitious, and perfectly aware of her effect on powerful men. She became Frederick's mistress in the early 1800s and quickly entrenched herself in his personal life. She lived in comfortable, well-funded style, thanks to stipends, gifts, and favors passed discreetly through intermediaries. That in itself wasn't unusual. Royal mistresses were a long-standing tradition. What made this relationship different was the paper trail. Soon, rumors began to circulate that Clark had been selling military commissions, positions in the British Army, to men who paid for access through her. The implication? That Frederick either turned a blind eye or, worse, facilitated it. When the scandal broke in 1809, it dominated the newspapers and the halls of Parliament. Clark was called to testify. Her wit was cutting, her composure infuriating to those expecting submission. She confirmed everything, and implicated the Duke in the process. The public was shocked, not because royal misconduct was new, but because this time it was administrative. Not a secret affair, but an accusation that the army was being auctioned off from a chaise lounge. Political cartoons depicted Clark in bed, handing out commissions like party favors, while Frederick signed off with a quill and a clueless grin. Frederick resigned as Commander-in-Chief, though he was later reinstated. Officially, nothing was ever proven about his direct involvement, but the damage was done. The scandal became shorthand for how proximity to the crown could corrupt, and how royal privilege often disguised transactional vice beneath its polished surface. His legacy? A nursery rhyme. The grand old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men. And apparently, quite a few of them bought their way in. But if Frederick let influence slip through the sheets, the next king on our list, Henry II, wove passion directly into power, letting his obsession with one woman haunt both his dynasty and the myths that followed. 22. King Henry II. If medieval monarchs were measured by their contradictions, Henry II would be carved in stone twice, once for empire, once for obsession. He was a ruler of titanic intellect and volcanic emotion, known for transforming English governance and reshaping the justice system. But behind the reforms and royal decrees stood a man whose private life pulsed with desire, resentment, and the kind of tangled, romantic legacy that would haunt his family for generations. Born in 1133, Henry inherited not just the English throne, but a vast swath of land stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. He ruled over what historians later called the Angevin Empire, a messy patchwork of territories bound more by ambition than national identity. Yet for all his geopolitical brilliance, Henry's legend is forever tethered to one figure, Rosamund Clifford. Known as Fair Rosamund, she was not a queen, nor even a noble by high standards. She was the daughter of a minor landowner, and yet she became one of the most enduring names in English royal lore. Henry's relationship with Rosamund wasn't officially recorded until late in his reign, but the gossip surrounding them grew louder with every year. Chroniclers described her as impossibly beautiful, gentle, and hidden away in a labyrinthine tower at Woodstock, a story that likely leans more myth than fact, but which speaks volumes about how their liaison was perceived. According to legend, Henry built a secret garden retreat for her, complete with winding paths designed to keep her from prying eyes, including, most famously, those of his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was not a woman known for patience, and certainly not one to forgive betrayal lightly. In the popular version of the tale, she discovered the hidden bower and confronted Rosamond with a dagger or a poisoned cup, depending on the storyteller's mood. There's no historical evidence for this dramatic encounter, but the myth stuck because it felt emotionally true. It reflected the danger that came with loving a king. What's more telling is how openly Henry flaunted the relationship. Rosamond was given estates, protection, and a place in royal memory, something no mere mistress could expect in that era. Whether their connection was romantic, strategic, or both, it clearly threatened Eleanor's already precarious place in Henry's world. Their marriage, once a formidable political alliance, had turned into a battlefield. Eleanor eventually led a rebellion against her husband, supported by their sons, some of whom Henry had imprisoned. It was a family drama worthy of Greek tragedy, rooted in power, loyalty, and wounded pride. When Rosamond died, young, possibly in a convent, Henry ensured she was buried with dignity in a prestigious nunnery. But even that couldn't erase the story. Ballads, poems, and tavern songs would revive her name for centuries, turning her into the embodiment of royal temptation, a woman desired by a king, reviled by a queen, and buried under myth. Henry's passions didn't just destabilize his marriage, they fractured his dynasty. And in a world where desire could collapse empires, his grandson James II would carry that same risk into a new era, where scandal took on an even more dangerous form. Open defiance of both religion and restraint. 23. King James II. If scandal was a torch passed through the generations of British royalty, James II didn't just carry it, he waved it like a banner. His reign is remembered mostly for its end. The glorious revolution, the bloodless overthrow, the quiet exile. But long before he lost his throne, James had already set fire to his reputation, not through one dramatic downfall, but through a lifetime of indiscretions, contradictions, and indulgences that made even his allies wince. Born in 1633, James was the younger brother of King Charles II and spent his formative years in exile during the English Civil War. While Charles returned to the throne in 1660 and leaned into pleasure with public flair, James took a different route. He cloaked his behavior in piety, while privately indulging in excess that made the piety look like a well-rehearsed costume. His conversion to Catholicism in the late 1660s sent tremors through Protestant England. But it wasn't just religion that made James dangerous in the eyes of his subjects. It was the way his personal appetites played into their worst fears. Rumors of lewd behavior followed him for years, and even though Protestant historians were more than happy to exaggerate, they didn't have to invent much. James had a well-documented string of mistresses. Arabella Churchill, sister of the future Duke of Marlborough, bore him multiple children. Catherine Sedley, the witty and sharp-tongued daughter of a libertine poet, became his long-standing favorite. She was neither conventionally beautiful nor politically advantageous, but James insisted on keeping her close, granting her a title, wealth, and access that scandalized the court. His queen, Mary of Modena, a young and devout Catholic Italian princess, was humiliated by his open affections for Sedley. And yet, for a man who presented himself as a champion of divine authority, James displayed little self-discipline. Even his supporters cringed at the hypocrisy. He condemned sin in public while fostering it in private. His court, especially in the early years, was a strange fusion of religious orthodoxy and personal indulgence, a place where sermons were delivered in the morning and quiet scandals unfolded by evening. Pamphleteers of the time, never ones to resist an easy target, accused him of surrounding himself with Catholic courtesans and indulging in foreign vices, a vague but loaded phrase used to imply moral deviance cloaked in foreign influence. The language was coded, but the intention was clear. James's personal life mirrored his political recklessness. The final straw for many was the birth of his son, James Francis Edward in 1688. The child's legitimacy was immediately questioned. Protestant nobles whispered that the baby had been smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. An absurd theory, but one that stuck because it was easier to believe than the idea that England's Catholic king had produced a Catholic heir. Behind this panic was the fear that James's indulgences were no longer personal. They were dynastic. His desires were rewriting the succession. When he was deposed later that year and fled to France, James left behind more than a failed reign. He left behind a monarchy terrified of what happened when private vice merged with public power. His exile wasn't just political, it was moral. A cautionary tale wrapped in religious robes, whispered through the corridors of a court that now knew how quickly the throne could be lost. And yet, while James fell under the weight of his contradictions, Queen Caroline of Brunswick, his descendant by marriage, would flip the scandalous script completely, not by being debauched in secret, but by behaving with such public impropriety that even Parliament had to look away. 24. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. If Queen Caroline of Brunswick had a motto, it might have been, "If they're going to watch, give them a show." In a monarchy that thrived on the illusion of private virtue and public duty, Caroline's life was a thunderous rejection of both. She wasn't subtle, she wasn't discreet, and perhaps most dangerously, she refused to be ashamed. Born in 1768, a German princess by blood but a disruptive force by temperament, Caroline arrived in England to marry the future George IV. The marriage, in theory, was a political alliance. In practice, it was a declaration of war. From the moment they met, Caroline and George detested each other. He found her vulgar and unrefined. She found him pompous, petty, and already drunk. He was hung over at their wedding. She made jokes about his weight. Within weeks, they had separated in all but name. Their only child, Princess Charlotte, was born the following year, and the couple promptly retreated into mutual contempt. What followed was a slow-motion disaster that played out over decades. George indulged in mistresses and excess. Caroline responded with something far more scandalous: visibility. Instead of fading into the background, she leaned into public life. She traveled widely, often without escort, and surrounded herself with an entourage of handsome young men. Wherever she went, Italy, Germany, France, rumors followed. Servants whispered, diplomats reported. Was she flirting? Was she faithful? Was she even trying to appear royal? The answer, increasingly, was no. By the early 1810s, Caroline's behavior had reached a level that even her enemies couldn't ignore. Her home on the continent became a kind of private court in exile, filled with music, laughter, and, reportedly, affectionate male companionship. Her closest attendant, a former servant named Bartolomeo Pergami, became the center of public speculation. They dined together, traveled together, and allegedly shared adjoining rooms. Whether their relationship was romantic, platonic, or simply provocative remains unknown. What mattered was perception, and Caroline seemed to delight in daring people to draw their own conclusions. When George finally became king in 1820, he was determined to keep her from being crowned alongside him. He launched a full-scale campaign to publicly disgrace her, even dragging her before the House of Lords in what became known as the Pains and Penalties Bill. It was, in essence, a political trial meant to strip her of her title and humiliate her into silence. Instead, it turned into one of the most sensational spectacles of the age. Caroline's popularity soared. The public saw her as the wronged woman, the outsider mocked and mistreated by a corrupt court. Crowds cheered for her in the streets. Satirical prints mocked George, portraying him as bloated and cowardly while Caroline stood defiant. She had, through sheer force of defiance, become a symbol of resistance, of irreverence, and of female autonomy in a monarchy that preferred its queens quiet and ornamental. She was barred from George's coronation. She showed up anyway, demanded entry, and was turned away. Within weeks, she fell ill and died. Whether from grief, illness, or sheer exhaustion. No one could say for certain. But Queen Caroline left behind more than scandal. She left a blueprint for rebellion, not through revolution but through refusal, and her defiance echoed forward into the next generation, where kings and queens would learn that misbehavior no longer needed to be secret. Because after her came Henry IV, a warrior king with a crown on his head and whispered debaucheries dogging his heels. 25. King Henry IV. King Henry IV is often remembered as the monarch who seized the English crown not by inheritance but by force. A usurper with a pious streak and a war-hardened edge, he ruled from 1399 to 1413 under the heavy shadow of rebellion and divine doubt. Yet beneath the armor of legitimacy, and beneath the polished rhetoric of royal authority, there were rumors that Henry, like many of his predecessors and successors, was more entangled in indulgence than his public image would ever suggest. Born in 1367 as Henry Bolingbroke, he was the son of John of Gaunt and grandson of Edward III. He had noble blood, but not the crown. That would come later, after he led a revolt against his cousin Richard II, deposed him, and claimed the throne. This act alone ensured Henry's reign would always be tinged with suspicion. A king who steals his crown must wear it tighter. To compensate, Henry leaned heavily on religion and statecraft. He championed orthodoxy, sponsored religious persecution, and tried to present himself as a divinely sanctioned ruler. But no amount of prayer or political maneuvering could quite silence the more persistent whispers about his private behavior. Chroniclers described him, often between cautious lines, as indulging in debaucheries unbefitting a Christian prince. The language was vague, deliberately so, but pointed. In the coded vocabulary of medieval historians, such terms usually pointed to habits that were known but unspoken: illicit relationships, inappropriate attachments, or acts that pushed against moral expectations. It's important to understand that Henry was not a libertine in the style of a Charles II or Edward VII. His vices, whatever they were, did not unfold in candlelit salons with wine and poets. They existed in the darker corners of his personal retinue: private entertainments, secret alliances, the occasional unexplained dismissal of a servant or courtier. The very fact that these behaviors were not public spectacles made them more troubling to his contemporaries. Discretion was one thing. Secrecy hinted at something more dangerous. There were accusations, too, of an interest in power through seduction, of using intimacy to manipulate alliances within his own court. Several sources suggest he maintained relationships that blurred the lines between political loyalty and personal dependency. In particular, his early years in exile, before he seized the crown, were marked by close associations with knights and retainers whose loyalty to Henry seemed to extend far beyond duty. Whether these relationships were romantic, exploitative, or something more complex is lost to history, but they left a trail of discomfort in their wake. What's remarkable is how little these rumors dented Henry's authority during his lifetime. Perhaps it was because he ruled during an age where war, plague, and rebellion occupied the public mind more than courtly rumors. Or perhaps it was because his most enduring legacy was not personal scandal, but dynastic stability. And yet, for all his careful image and martial posture, Henry IV left behind the suggestion that power, even when seized, can never fully silence personal contradiction. A lesson not lost on his descendants, including Mary II, whose own reputation would be quietly marred by whispers of foreign vices behind the throne. 26. Queen Mary II. Queen Mary II is often remembered as half of a political partnership. When she and her husband William of Orange took the English throne in 1689 during the so-called Glorious Revolution, it was sold as a triumph of Protestantism, parliamentary authority, and serene order. She was portrayed as the dutiful daughter who accepted her father's deposition for the good of the realm, a queen who ruled not from desire but from obligation. But beneath the surface of that polished image was a woman whose private life remains a field of quiet speculation, laced with contradictions, coded rumors, and the ever-present question, what was really going on behind the curtains of court? Mary was born in 1662, the eldest daughter of James II, and raised staunchly Protestant despite her father's later Catholic conversion. Her marriage to her cousin William of Orange was arranged when she was just 15. He was small, asthmatic, and politically calculating. She was tall, devout, and emotionally expressive. Theirs was not a marriage of equals, but it was a union of convenience designed to keep Protestant alliances strong and dynastic bloodlines in order. Publicly, Mary played the role of the loyal wife with determined grace. She deferred to William in state matters and often declared her love for him in letters and speeches. But their private life was more brittle. William had little patience for courtly affection and often retreated into long silences and long absences. Mary, meanwhile, filled the void with faith, letter writing, and close friendships that grew increasingly intimate. It was these friendships that stirred the first real whispers. Mary surrounded herself with a tight circle of women, many of whom shared her religious fervor, but also displayed a level of emotional intimacy that drew notice. There were intense letters, shared diaries, and behaviors that, while not openly condemned, were quietly scrutinized. One courtier later wrote that Mary kept a household of women who lived in holy admiration of her person and her piety, neither of which could be questioned aloud. The phrase foreign vices began appearing in private correspondence, often referring not just to William's Dutch courtiers or religious leanings, but to the curious emotional arrangements within the royal household. The implication was that both Mary and William had tastes considered un-English, both in faith and in affection. Rumors swirled about their coldness toward each other, their lack of children, and the odd, insular nature of their domestic lives. Whether these murmurs pointed to repressed identities, private discontent, or simply cultural friction, they left a permanent haze over Mary's otherwise virtuous legacy. She died young in 1694 of smallpox, mourned by a court that had come to rely on her softening presence. But her image, like her marriage, remains quietly contested. Mary ruled beside a man she did not choose, for a cause she did not control, while crafting a private world all her own. And in that quiet world, she joined a long tradition of royals whose reputations were shaped not by action, but by absence, just like her distant cousin Edward VI, whose silence was so pronounced that even his alleged desires were left to the whispers of those brave enough to imagine them. 27. King Edward VI. Of all the Tudor monarchs, King Edward VI is perhaps the most ghost-like. Sandwiched between his larger-than-life father Henry VIII and his tragic half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, Edward ruled for just 6 years and died before reaching adulthood. His official portrait, gaunt, solemn, and almost doll-like, shows a boy king dressed like a man, weighed down by regalia far heavier than his frame. His reign, such as it was, is remembered for advancing Protestant reforms, executing advisors, and laying the groundwork for religious instability. But what has rarely been discussed, at least outside the footnotes, is how Edward became the subject of whispered rumors, not because of what he did, but because of how little anyone could say about what he desired. Born in 1537, the long-awaited male heir to Henry VIII, Edward was raised to be a living symbol. He was England's future, Protestantism's promise, and his father's vindication after years of failed marriages. From the start, his life was hyper-managed. He was protected from disease, politics, and even physical affection. Tutors controlled his reading. Courtiers controlled his image. The boy himself seemed to vanish beneath layers of duty and doctrine. And yet, even in this heavily curated environment, there were murmurs. Several Protestant reformers, writing after Edward's death, alluded to an excess of admiration the young king showed for certain older male courtiers. These mentions were carefully phrased, vague enough to avoid scandal, but suggestive. There were references to Edward's unseasonable fixations and his attachment to noble examples. euphemisms that, in the context of 16th century political discourse, often hinted at unspoken concerns about propriety. Whether these accounts reflect real tension, innocent mentorships, or posthumous attempts to explain the king's reserved behavior is unclear. What is clear is that Edward never publicly expressed interest in marriage, though this was expected of him from the moment he was old enough to sign a letter. Foreign princesses were proposed. Alliances were considered. But Edward never engaged with any of it. His letters are formal, his diaries meticulous, and his personal life a blank wall. In a court defined by seduction, intrigue, and flamboyant emotional entanglement, Edward was conspicuously cold. Some historians have suggested his health may have played a role. Edward suffered from chronic illness throughout his brief reign, likely tuberculosis or another wasting disease, which may have dulled his emotional development or left him preoccupied with mortality rather than courtly love. Others propose that his intense Protestantism, instilled by his tutors, discouraged emotional indulgence entirely. He was, in essence, a boy raised as a doctrine. When he died at just 15, the kingdom plunged into a succession crisis. But Edward himself left little more than a theological will and an oddly empty royal diary. No great romances, no scandals, just silence, carefully maintained. And it's that silence that makes the rumors linger. Because sometimes what's most unsettling in royalty isn't excess, it's absence. A lesson well understood by his Jacobite counterpart, James Francis Edward Stuart, whose guilt-soaked confessions revealed a mind troubled not by what he did, but by what he feared he might have wanted. 28. James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender. There's something uniquely haunting about a man who was born to be king but never crowned, especially when that man spends his entire life convinced he was denied the throne not because of politics, but because of something shameful within himself. James Francis Edward Stuart, better known as the Old Pretender, occupies that strange historical space reserved for monarchs who almost were. His entire existence was defined by absence, the absent crown, the absent father, the absent victory that his supporters chased for decades across cold European landscapes. But beneath the dynastic ambitions and failed rebellions, James left behind something even more peculiar, a trail of letters, journals, and private writings that suggested a lifelong battle with desires he couldn't name and couldn't escape. Born in 1688 during the brief and contentious reign of his father, King James II, James Francis Edward's arrival was immediately clouded in suspicion. Protestant England, already bracing itself for a Catholic monarch, responded to his birth with conspiracy theories. He was famously accused of being a changeling, smuggled into the Queen's bed in a warming pan to fake a royal heir. The story was absurd, yet effective. Within months, James II was deposed, and the infant prince was whisked away to France in exile. He grew up in Versailles under the protection of Louis XIV, surrounded by ceremony but devoid of power. From a young age, James was told he was the rightful king of England, Scotland, and Ireland. That sense of entitlement was drilled into him like catechism. But exile has a strange effect on royal children. They are given all the symbols of authority, titles, crowns on plates, full ceremonial processions, but none of the substance. And for James, that gap between image and reality only widened with age. In his early 20s, James began keeping spiritual journals, confiding in priests, and writing long, tortured letters to confessors and confidants. These letters, some preserved, others referenced secondhand by contemporaries, are filled with a kind of anxious remorse. He wrote often of impure thoughts, unnatural temptations, and shameful weaknesses of the flesh. The language is deliberately vague, but the pattern is unmistakable. He wasn't confessing political mistakes. He was consumed by something more internal, more intimate. Modern historians, reading between the heavily redacted lines, have speculated that James was likely tormented by sexual desires that clashed with his strict Catholic upbringing. The references to guilt, to the evil spirit that visits me in solitude, and to his disgust at the self I cannot rid myself of, all point toward a deeply conflicted inner life. Some have suggested that James may have been struggling with same-sex attraction, a notion that, for a devout Catholic pretender to the British throne, would have been psychologically devastating. It didn't help that his personal relationships were marked by cold distance. He married Maria Klementina Sobieska in 1719, a Polish princess chosen more for her pedigree than compatibility. The marriage was fraught from the start. Klementina left James shortly after the birth of their second son, claiming religious disputes and poor treatment. But the rumors whispered something else: that she found James emotionally vacant, obsessively pious, and locked in a kind of internal war she couldn't touch. James's court in exile, which moved from France to Italy, never attracted the romanticism that would later surround his son, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Where Charlie was gallant and reckless, James was cautious and consumed by ritual. He dressed like a monarch but moved like a penitent. His household was reportedly somber, his presence austere. Visitors described a man who seemed to carry his own failure like a physical weight. There were no famous mistresses, no charming liaisons, no outward signs of pleasure. Just the quiet repetition of royal duty and religious devotion, as if he could atone his way to a crown that would never come. Even his allies were puzzled by his lack of charisma. Jacobite plots failed repeatedly, not only because of bad timing or poor strategy, but because James inspired loyalty without love. His followers believed in his claim, but rarely in him. He had the blood, the name, the lineage, but something was missing. Perhaps that's what makes James Francis Edward Stuart so compelling. Not because of what he did, his life was mostly a long, graceful decline, but because of what he seemed to be hiding. His letters weren't confessions of action, but of fear. Fear that his private longings disqualified him from public greatness, that his thoughts were, in some way, the real reason for his exile. And unlike his descendants, James didn't live in a world that could accommodate complexity. He lived in one where guilt was theology and temptation was proof of moral failure. So he buried it, quietly, like so many monarchs before him. But unlike those monarchs, James never even got the chance to rule. All he left behind was a question. And that question, that eerie, lingering silence, is what echoes centuries later when another royal, born into unimaginable privilege and modern celebrity, breaks the silence. Because Prince Harry didn't hide his scandals, he printed them. And for better or worse, he dared to tell the story that so many before him swallowed. 29. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. For most of British royal history, scandal has been a whispered thing, handled in corridors, buried in footnotes, scrubbed clean with carefully worded press releases and commemorative portraits. But Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, did something few in the Windsor line ever dared. He told the truth, or at least his truth, and he did it loudly. On television, in best-selling memoirs, and across every glowing screen from Buckingham Palace to Los Angeles. He didn't wait for history to reinterpret him. He rewrote his own script, mid-reign, mid-life, with a level of candor that made even hardened palace officials flinch. Born in 1984, the second son of Charles and Diana, Harry was never meant to be the future king, but he was always expected to behave like one. He was raised within the velvet grip of the institution, with its rigid protocols, hereditary expectations, and silent demands. And for a while he played along. As a child, he stood in line at royal funerals, waved from balconies, and endured the uniquely surreal experience of seeing his mother mourned by millions, while being watched for any sign of personal emotion. The spotlight that clung to Diana passed directly to him, and unlike his older brother, Harry never quite learned to look comfortable under it. His youth became tabloid fodder before he even turned 20. There were the parties, the Nazi costume, the nightclub stumbles, and the endless parade of headlines painting him as the rogue prince, the fun one, the bad one, the broken one. Every royal has a role, and Harry's was increasingly scripted by people who never met him. The palace tried to contain it. They issued apologies, tightened schedules, dispatched handlers. But Harry kept misbehaving, not maliciously, but visibly, and in a family built on the currency of image, that was enough. The most unsettling detail, though, didn't come from paparazzi photos. It came later, in Spare, his memoir. There, for the first time, Harry pulled back the curtain not just on royal life, but on his own psyche. He wrote openly about drug use, grief, therapy, anxiety, frostbite in places no prince should have frostbite, and sexual encounters so awkwardly rendered that readers blushed for him. He wasn't just airing dirty laundry. He was holding it up to the light and asking, "What did you expect me to do with all this?" His confessions weren't glamorous. They were blunt, deeply human, and at times uncomfortably specific. He detailed his first sexual experience as a humiliating episode taking place in a field behind a pub with an older woman who treated me like a young stallion. It was the kind of detail the monarchy had spent centuries avoiding, specificity. Royals are meant to exist in archetypes, not anecdotes. But Harry dragged the myth into the mud, where it had always secretly lived. What made it more provocative was his tone. Harry didn't seem repentant. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking to be understood. And that, perhaps, is what made the institution bristle most. Because the crown can survive scandal. It can survive adultery, affairs, secret children, mistresses, even murder. But it cannot survive honesty, at least not honesty that refuses to apologize. When Harry married Meghan Markle, the fault lines widened. She was American, biracial, divorced, an actress, and, most damning, unwilling to be silent. Together they represented a cultural shift the palace couldn't digest. Their wedding was televised to millions. Their exit from royal life just 2 years later was televised too, only in a different format. Interviews, documentaries, podcasts. Their side of the story arrived not in whispers, but in studio lighting. What's often lost in the commentary is the moral inversion at play. Previous royals were condemned for secret perversions, for hidden affairs, for appetites cloaked in piety. Harry, by contrast, was condemned for telling the truth, for admitting what others wouldn't, that royal life can be suffocating, that inherited power doesn't heal grief, and that sometimes even princes want to run away. He was mocked for his openness, called weak, dramatic, disloyal. But behind the media frenzy was a quieter shift, the realization that the monarchy had spent generations burying the things Harry chose to speak aloud. Shame, trauma, identity, autonomy. Not scandal in the traditional sense, but vulnerability rendered scandalous by the mere fact of being public. Prince Harry's story doesn't end in exile. It continues, reshaped by his refusal to play the part. He's not the first royal to rebel, but he may be the first to do it without disguising the emotional cost. His rebellion wasn't in action, but in admission. And if Harry told too much, the royal who follows him in this strange lineage of scandal told nothing at all. She didn't need to. Princess Margaret lived like a secret someone else kept for her, hedonistic, glamorous, tragic, and utterly unwilling to be anything but herself, even as the monarchy watched in horror from behind its immaculate drapes. 30. Princess Margaret. In a family built on discipline, discretion, and the art of pretending nothing ever happened, Princess Margaret was the exception that proved and punctured the rule. She didn't rebel in speeches or interviews. She didn't storm out of palaces or publish explosive memoirs. Instead, she turned her life into a slow, beautiful defiance of everything the monarchy stood for: stoicism, suppression, and the illusion of virtue. Margaret didn't dismantle the institution, she simply refused to obey it. Born in 1930 as the younger daughter of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, Margaret grew up in the peculiar role of the royal spare, a position loaded with responsibility but stripped of real power. Her sister Elizabeth was duty-bound from birth. Margaret, by contrast, was given all the constraints of royalty and none of the control. It was a role she chafed against for the rest of her life. In her early years, Margaret was known as charming, vivacious, and wickedly sharp. She had the voice of a debutante and the timing of a comedian. Her beauty was compared to movie stars. Her presence lit up even the most rigid drawing rooms. But that glamour came with an edge. She drank too much, smoked too openly, stayed out too late, and had a penchant for men who were too old, too married, or too bohemian for palace approval. In short, she behaved like a person, which was, in royal terms, practically treasonous. The first and perhaps most defining scandal of her life came in the form of Group Captain Peter Townsend. He was dashing, divorced, and completely unacceptable as a suitor for a princess in the 1950s. Their romance captivated the press and horrified the establishment. In a different life, they would have married. But in this one, Margaret was told that marrying Townsend would mean losing her royal title, income, and status. The crown gave her a choice: duty or love. She chose duty, but it broke her. After that, Margaret's public image hardened into something more theatrical. She married Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, a society photographer with artistic flair and complicated habits. Their relationship at first seemed like a fairy tale shot in Vogue, but behind the scenes it was famously volatile. Affairs, silences, and mutual cruelty were quietly acknowledged but rarely confirmed. When they eventually divorced in 1978, the first royal divorce since Henry VIII, it was treated not as a scandal, but as a weary inevitability. Margaret spent the rest of her life in a haze of hedonism and retreat. Her island hideaway in Mystique became legendary, a paradise of barefoot parties, jazz at sunrise, and the kind of casual intimacy the Windsors found terrifying. She was photographed in swimsuits and silks, cigarette in hand, her expression always somewhere between amusement and disdain. She kept lovers, lost friends, and watched as the world around her modernized without her. Thus, monarchy kept its distance, like a family pretending not to notice the relative who's singing too loudly at dinner. What makes Margaret's story so enduring isn't the scale of her scandal. It's the way she embodied contradiction. She was both insider and outsider, both loyalist and rebel. She followed the rules just long enough to break them with flair. Her life was not a tabloid disaster. It was a slow-burning refusal to conform. She didn't ask to be understood. She asked to be left alone. She died in 2002, having outlived her reputation. The monarchy mourned her quietly, but the public remembered the misfit who lived like a movie star and sulked like a schoolgirl. Margaret didn't reform the royal family, but she cracked its surface just enough to let in a little smoke, a little jazz, and a reminder that even palaces have shadows. And in those shadows, across centuries, behind silk curtains and ceremonial smiles, they've all danced. Kings and queens, heirs and spares, loving and loathed, discreet and defiant. They lived as symbols, but loved as people. And it's in that gap, the fragile space between crown and craving, that the truest stories are hidden, and almost never explained.